All right, so we have a jam-packed session for you all this evening. With no further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Nathaniel to start us on our briefing.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. And wow, thank you to all of you for making time to spend with us this evening to talk about mobilizing environmental voters in New York State. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And tonight we have a briefing on mobilizing environmental voters in New York. If you are anything like me, you like to know what's coming. And so I like to provide a table of contents or an index for these briefings. And the way that we're going to start is with a very, very quick introduction to the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are new to our work, I'm sorry, this will not be an in-depth introduction to every aspect of our work. That's not what tonight's session is designed to be. Instead, this will be a very, very quick overview because what we want to spend most of our time on is item 2 here, and that is an in-depth analysis of what we are seeing in our identification work and our predictive models on voter files. We've identified hundreds of thousands of low propensity climate first voters in New York. And we want to tell you all about them, where they are, and the opportunities that we see in mobilizing them this year. And then finally, as Shannon mentioned, at the end, we will have a Q&A session. Because of the size of our crowd this evening, we ask you not to put your questions in the chat. Instead, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A folder. Shannon will either answer them there or she'll hold on to them and ask them of me at the end. All right, let's jump into things. In a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we turn non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. That's it. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit. We do not endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. In fact, we're not even in the mind-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior change business. We're just laser focused on what you see here, which is identifying people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They care so much about climate and the environment that it is their number one priority, yet they are not voting. And so they then are ripe for a purely behavioral intervention. And as I hope to show you over the next few minutes, this is a big opportunity because we live at a moment in time where it's become really hard to change people's opinions about anything, especially climate change. But changing their behavior is a lot easier, and it's also testable so we can see what works and what doesn't work. This is also, for better or for worse, a really big group of people. Just to give you an idea, this year, in the 19 states that we work in, we have identified 4.8 million individuals who are registered to vote. They're already registered to vote. They're highly likely to list climate or the environment as their number one priority, yet they're unlikely to vote this November. And by unlikely to vote, we mean we've looked in voter files and we see that they didn't vote in the last presidential election or any election since then. So when we see that vote history, we think, you know what, these people need a sophisticated mobilization campaign to nudge them into voting. And yeah, maybe you see a number that big and you're shaking your head in frustration, and I wouldn't blame you. But we have shown over and over again at the Environmental Voter Project that we can identify these voters, turn them into new voters, and then eventually into consistent voters. Very, very briefly, this is how we do it. And again, if you're new to the Environmental Voter Project, please forgive me for going quickly over this. But I want to get to the core of what this evening's briefing is about. The first thing that we do is identification, right? we want to find all these non-voting environmentalists, but we obviously can't talk to like every single individual American, right? So instead, what we do is we build highly accurate models that help us predict who these climate first non-voters are. And the way we do that is we poll thousands and thousands of people, isolate the ones who tell us climate's their number one priority, and then we work with data scientists to look at publicly available data and learn as much as we can about these people who just told us that climate's their number one priority. And then we start trying to find other people like them. And it's a long, iterative process where we fine tune and refine these models. But at the end of it, we have a highly accurate list of individuals, not demographic groups, but actual individual voters who are really, really likely to not just care about climate, but literally listed as their number one priority. And then we can just cross-reference them with their public vote histories. And we set aside the ones who are already good voters and just focus on the ones who we think are unlikely to vote. Because whether you vote or not is public record. So that's a pretty easy thing to figure out. All right. So that's the end of step one. We now have this pool of unlikely to vote super environmentalists. That brings us to step two, mobilization. Now, this is a group of people who don't need their minds changed about anything. They just need their behavior changed. And so now we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. We can talk about whatever it takes to turn these people from non-voters into new voters. And so we run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, testing which messages work best with which subgroups of these voters to get them to vote. We work with thousands of volunteers to canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all with tested messaging that is optimized to just turn these non-voting environmentalists into super voters. All right, those are the first two steps. I realize I've just breezed through a lot here, but if you want more detail on either of those things, we have individual briefing that they're called like mini briefing videos. We have one on how we identify these environment first voters, and we have another on which messages have been shown to work best at mobilizing them. And so Shannon will put those links in the chat if you're interested in learning more about either step one or step two that I just went through. All right. So we've identified these low propensity environment first voters. We've mobilized thousands of volunteers to use proven messaging to try to get them to vote. That brings us to step three, habit reinforcement. You don't need to know as much about behavioral science as we do to be able to guess, to be able to intuitively understand that if you're trying to turn someone into a habitual, consistent voter, you can't just talk to them once every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you build good habits. And so we take this step three, habit reinforcement, very, very seriously. We use every election as an opportunity to talk to these voters. Local, state, federal, primary, general, special, you name it. Just this year in 2024, just since January 1st of this year, we've already been active in 153 different elections. I'm serious, 153 in our 19 states. And that's not because all of them were important for climate or environmental policymaking. I freely admit that many, if not most of them, weren't important for climate policymaking at all. But what they were important for is changing people's behavior and turning them into habitual voters. Because at the end of it all, the only way you can get someone to vote for the first time is to get them to turn out for an election, right? And so our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is If we're in the business of making new voters, how dare we let an election pass us by without using it as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity to talk to these targets? Because ultimately that brings us to step 4, which is our true goal, which is to change the electorate. Yes, we have a long history now of having a big impact in one-off elections, but our ultimate goal is a longer-term goal, and that is to change the electorate. Because ultimately we know that nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so if we are able over time to dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who consistently vote, not just in presidential elections, but also in state primaries or city council races or county executive races, well, if we're able to do that, then politicians will follow, not out of the goodness of their hearts. I am tired of waiting for politicians to lead on climate out of the goodness of their hearts. No, they'll follow because their job will depend on it. I mean, politicians have to go where the votes are. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's just the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And so it's incumbent upon us in the climate movement and us at the Environmental Voter Project to do everything we can to dramatically increase the number of climate first voters who show up for every election. And that's what we are laser focused on. If you want more information about why we focus on this aspect of power building in the climate movement and the ways in which we do it, you can find more information at environmentalvoter.org/about. And then the last little thing I just want to touch on before I stop this small intro to EVP is some of our results. We measure our impact in 2 ways. One is our short-term impact, which is our impact in one-off specific elections. And the second is our longer-term impact. So we are active in these 19 states. And what we do is whenever we mobilize voters, we submit our work to what's called randomized control trials. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but very quickly, what we do is we set aside a control group of unlikely to vote environmentalists, and we never talk to them. The remaining group, called our treatment group, usually we randomly set aside about 15% and don't talk to them. The remaining 85%, those are the ones we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this behavioral science informed messaging. Then the election happens. And then a few months later, public voter files are updated. And then we can compare turnout in our control group to turnout in our treatment group, the people we actually spoke to. And as long as that initial separation was truly random and the numbers are big enough, what this then allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. And just since 2020, just in the last 3.5 years, we've been active in over 900 different elections. And we probably increased turnout among low propensity climate voters in almost all of them. But we're not interested in probably. What we want to do is figure out, were there any elections where these randomized control trials showed with statistical significance, which means it wasn't due to random occurrence, that the Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for boosting turnout while controlling for all the other campaigns and money that was spent? And it turns out that's happened quite often over the last 3.5 years. In 2020, in 2021, in 2022, and last year in 2023. We were able to show with statistically significant results that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout among our targets by as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And these numbers might not sound like a lot to you, but ask Donald Trump how big that 1.8 percentage points is in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you. These are big, big numbers in this business. And we're extraordinarily proud of them. And for those of you who have donated to support our efforts and have volunteered to contact our voters with this messaging, I hope you are extraordinarily proud of them as well. The last thing I'm going to mention before we get to the New York data is the second way that we measure our impact, and that is our long-term impact. Since we launched a one city proof of concept at the end of 2015 and then 2016, we have slowly expanded to 6 states, then 12, then I think it was 17, and now 19. And over that time, we have now communicated with over 10.5 million unique individual voters. And some of them, obviously, we've communicated with for lots and lots of elections. Others we've only communicated with for one election. But what all of those voters have in common now is, one, they've all been tagged in our voter file so we can follow them. And two, they were all unlikely to vote, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of about 3 weeks ago, we saw that over 1.8 million of those 10.5 million low propensity climate voters had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become such consistent super voters that if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and you'd say, oh, yep, that person's likely to vote. Got to go talk to them. Got to make sure they know who to vote for. And maybe I'll find out what issues they care about too. We have helped turn these people into first-class citizens, people who politicians actually pay attention to. Now, one caveat, I want to be clear. This metric, this long-term metric, is different from the previous one, different from the randomized control trial. We can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters. But boy, are we pretty darn responsible for it. There's no other group that's now been active in almost 2,000 different elections since we started, working year in, year out in hundreds of elections each year to change these voters' behavior. And so tonight, I want you to think about not only the impact we can have with people who we're talking to for the very first time, but also the cumulative impact, because we are now at the end of a pipeline of elections where we've been communicating with a lot of these low propensity climate voters in New York. And now we're coming up at the highest turnout election we have every 4 years. And there are a whole bunch of people who we've now primed to maybe vote for the first time because of the great work that many of you have been helping us do. All right. That's the end of the introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. If you'd like more information about our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results, and we'll have that link in the chat. Let's get to our New York data. When we built these predictive models that I told you about, where we were able to individually identify registered voters who were super likely to list climate as their #1 priority, yet they're unlikely to vote this fall, this is what we found. Almost 807,000 individuals in New York. And this is after we set aside our control group. These are just the ones we're targeting. 807,000. I know that sounds like a big number, but let me give you some context so you can realize just how big it is. In the last presidential election in New York, only 8.7 million ballots were cast. So this group of unlikely to vote super environmentalists who are already registered, they're so big they represent almost 10% of all ballots that were cast in the last presidential election in New York. It's a big, big number. Later on, the next few slides, we're going to drill down into a lot of these specific congressional districts. But I just already want to get you thinking about the fact that there are seven congressional districts in New York that handicappers like the Cook Political Report now call competitive. And nationwide, there are only 70 competitive congressional districts. So the fact that 10% of them are in New York State is huge. There are only 3 in Florida. There are only 3 in Texas. The fact that there are 7 in New York is enormous. If any of you are on here and you think, oh, I'm kind of interested in New York, but it's really not going to be important this year. Oh, no. I must dissuade you of that. New York will likely decide which party controls the House of Representatives after this year because of all of these competitive congressional races. Obviously, November 5th is the most important election date, but June 25th, which is coming up, is the state primary. And that's important not just because there are some competitive primaries throughout the state, in state legislative races and in some of these congressional districts, but also because that is a precious opportunity to talk to these low propensity environmental voters and move them along that pathway to becoming first-time voters. All right, before we delve into particular congressional districts, I want to tell you what the demographic profile is of these low propensity environmental voters that we've identified in New York. First, I want you to look at this very bottom line here that says reg voters. What that is the demographic breakdown of all registered voters in New York State. So the way to read this is 7.6. That means 7.6% of registered voters in New York are age 18 to 24. Go to this next block. 17.1% of registered voters are 25 to 34. And you can see we get into the sex data and then the racial data. And I think that's important to give you this baseline of all registered voters, because when I start telling you what these low propensity environmental voters that we're targeting are, you need to have some context. And so at the bottom there is the demographic breakdown for all registered voters. Now let's look at this row above it. LPEVs, which stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are the people we're targeting. Well, the first thing you might notice is, whoa, they are disproportionately young. That probably doesn't surprise many of you, that people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet are unlikely to vote are disproportionately young. In this instance, maybe, what does that pencil out to? 69% of them are under age 35, whereas only 25% of registered voters in New York are under age 35. Now, even though that is a disproportionately young population, I do want to say this is actually older than what we see in many other states. There are other states where 90% of the low propensity environmental voters are under age 35. In most of our states, they're in the 80 to 85% range. So the fact that in New York, it's only 69%, that's actually interesting. That's actually interesting. Where we see the really big difference from other states is in this 35 to 49-year-old range. It's rarely that high in other states. Rarely that high in other states. Whereas this 50 to 64 and 65 and up, that's similar to what we see in other states. So this is pretty different. There are a decent number of people in their late 30s and 40s in New York who care deeply about climate and the environment, much more than we see in other states. Okay, voter files don't track gender data, they track sex data. When we look at these sex breakdowns and compare all registered voters to the low propensity environmental voters that we're targeting, we don't see much of a difference at all. Yes, there is a gender gap, or in this case, a sex gap of about 9 points, but that's not terribly different from the underlying gender gap that exists among all registered voters in New York. So there isn't a big difference there. That too is different from what we see in other states, though. In many of our other states, we do see a difference in the sex breakdown, where there will be a 5 to 8 point gender gap among all registered voters, where women are more prevalent than men among registered voters. But among our population, the low propensity environmental voters we're turning out, sometimes the gender gap is twice as big. We don't see that in New York. So New York is disproportionately young, but not as disproportionately young as in other states. Similarly, we see a gender gap in New York, but not a very big one, and not nearly as big as what we see in some other states. Finally, look at the racial breakdown here. 64% of registered voters in New York are white. Only 55% of our target population is white. And that is driven solely by Black voters, and in particular, Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. This is a trend that we are also seeing in other states, but this is particularly dramatic among AAPI voters in New York. The fact that, one, the AAPI population is so large in New York, but still, two, we are able to have almost twice as many, or they are twice as prevalent in our target population as they are among registered voters. That's pretty extraordinary. You'll also see this. Look at the numbers among Hispanic voters. We wouldn't have seen this 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Hispanic voters were a bit more consistently progressive. They certainly more consistently cared deeply about climate and the environment. And we're seeing that break down in some states, not all states, not in states like Nevada or Arizona or certain parts of Texas, but we're seeing it break down in New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, places like that. All right. So that's what we're talking about. If you want to conjure up an image, and obviously this is painting with a very, very broad brush here, but if you want to think about the demographic makeup of these low propensity environmental voters in New York, this is what we're talking about. All right, now let's delve into these 7 super competitive congressional races in New York that could decide control of the U.S. House of Representatives. First, we're going to talk about the Hudson Valley and Central New York, because these 7 competitive congressional districts can really be broken down into 2 separate regions. So we're going to talk about them as 2 separate regions. We're talking about the Hudson Valley and then bleeding over into Binghamton and up into Utica and Syracuse. And the 4 districts we're talking about here are the 17th, then up here the 18th, and then the 19th, which is just enormous and goes all the way over to Binghamton, and then up here to the 22nd. You'll see over here, for each district, we have added a partisan lean number. What a partisan lean number calculates is it looks at the last 4 federal elections, so the last 2 presidentials and the last 2 midterms, and it calculates the average vote total for Democrats versus Republicans over those 4 elections. And there's a recency bias. It counts the 2 most recent elections more than the 2 older elections. But what you end up then with is a national average for each congressional district, or a national average for congressional districts. And then what this partisan lean means is, in New York 17, a D+3 district, what that means is, on average, over the last 4 federal elections, this district trends 3 points more Democrat than the average congressional district. So it's 3 points more Democrat. Give you an idea of how small that is? In some of these briefings, I mean, even elsewhere in New York, we're looking at districts that are like D+30 or R+35. Hell, I live in a district up in Boston that I think is like a D plus 39 district or a D plus 40 district. The fact that these are D plus 3, D plus 1, even, and D plus 1 is absurdly close, absurdly competitive. Here are the incumbents that you see there. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with these districts, it's almost like they're in reverse order on the map here. So the 17th is the furthest south here, then the 18th, then the 19th, and then the 22nd. And you'll see here are the number of targets who we've identified and will be trying to mobilize in each of those districts. And these are really, really big numbers. I mean, it's very hard to generalize with turnout, but I would be surprised if more than 350,000 people, 330,000 people end up voting in each of these districts in November. So the fact that we've identified as much as 37,502 targets in the 19th, which has no partisan lean at all, that's a big deal. That's a lot of potential political power. And just to give you a sense of some of where some of these people are. So the furthest south district, the 17th, you'll see a little bit closer to the river, and then it disperses a bit more once we get up here. 18th, where we've got over 34,000 voters. This is getting a little bit more dispersed. Little bit more dispersed. The 19th, that was that huge district that goes from like Catskill over to like Binghamton and up to Cortland here. You'll see not in the rural areas. We're looking at around urban areas. And obviously you're not looking at 37,000 dots here. This is a random sample of about 5,000 dots, just to give you an idea of where they're concentrated. And then in the 22nd district, here we're talking about Utica and Syracuse. And you'll see we don't have nearly as many targets once we get outside of those two urban areas. These four districts, Hudson Valley going over to Binghamton, then up to Utica and Syracuse, are just excruciatingly close, super important. And again, just to go back, we've identified an absurdly large, I mean, it looks like what, over 130,000, maybe 135,000 individual voters there who we know by name and street address to be unlikely to vote super environmentalists. And we have these messages that we know work to turn them into new voters. These are the people we're going to be targeting over the next 6 months. All right. Now let's get into Long Island. In Long Island, there are 4 congressional districts. All of them are pretty close, but most of the prognosticators, for a whole host of reasons, aren't viewing the 2nd congressional district, which you see down here, as being competitive. Now, it's only an R+3 district, but for a whole bunch of reasons, people aren't currently viewing it as competitive. We can quibble about whether that's truly the case, but this is not something I'm an expert on. I don't research what makes certain districts competitive or not. I want to be an expert on how to find non-voting environmentalists and turn them into a huge voting bloc. And so we're going to focus on the 3 that everybody agrees. When I say focus, tonight we're going to focus on the 3 that everybody agrees are going to be competitive. The 1st district, that's over in the Hamptons here and the northeastern part of Long Island. That's an R+3 district with a Republican incumbent. You see, we've identified over 31,000 targets there. The 3rd congressional district, that was George Santos's district that Tom Suozzi just won a special election in. That's a D+2 partisan lean. We've identified over 37,000 voters there. And then the 4th, D+5 with a Republican incumbent, Anthony D'Esposito. We've identified almost 27,000 voters there. To give you an idea, of what our targets look like for people who are familiar with that. First, let's look at the 3rd district. That's this one here. And it goes from Oyster Bay down all the way over into Queens, even almost all the way over into a little bit of Flushing over here. We've identified 37,000 targets there. Then south of that is this 4th congressional district. We're talking about Uniondale all the way down to Jones Beach here. Not nearly as concentrated, but still pretty darn dense, almost 27,000 voters. And then out in the 1st district, talking about the Hamptons and just in general, that sort of northeastern block of Long Island there, an R+3 district where we've identified over 31,000 of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists. Again, these are our targets. These are the people who we will be mobilizing for the next 26 weeks. What we are looking at over the next 6 months is we are hoping to raise and spend $1.1 million to mobilize the over 800,000 low propensity environmental voters we've identified. We will be paying particular attention to the districts we just spoke about and spending much, much more in those districts than elsewhere. We will not be keeping our powder dry until October and November, though, because what we have found over and over and over again is that the best way to get someone to vote in November is to start talking to them now. And so this June state primary that's coming up is a really, really special opportunity. It is going to be so much easier to communicate with our targets in June when there isn't that much static around, and it's going to be so much cheaper to convert them into new voters. And so this is a really, really important opportunity. Now, I don't want to mislead you into thinking we're going to throw the kitchen sink at these people in June. Of course we're not, but we are going to run some light digital ads. We may do some direct mail. We're certainly going to have robust phone campaigns in June. Then, when we get to late September, October, and November, we're going to be running robust digital ads, robust direct mail campaigns, and robust phone campaigns to all of these voters. And to be clear, we have now run enough randomized control trials that every message we will be delivering has been proven to increase turnout among low propensity environmental voters. That's our digital ads, that's our direct mail, that's even our phone call script. But we can't do it unless we have the money to make it happen. And so you are here today because you want to learn about the opportunities that we have in New York State. And I got to tell you, we need your help raising this money. Because if we're going to take advantage of these opportunities that we just told you about, we need to start by making tonight successful. And thanks to 3 different matching donors, the first $30,000 in donations will be matched. Shannon's going to put the donation link for this event in the chat. Every dollar that is donated, at least the first 30,000, will be matched and will go towards New York. And I got to tell you something. Usually when, we've been doing some of these state-specific briefings, sometimes we're able to get matching donors, sometimes we're not able to get matching donors. But when we get matching donors, usually we start the event already having gotten 50 or 60% of that matchable amount. We're not even close to that. We're at about 25%, maybe 30% before we started. We're barely at 10,000. We've got a lot of room to go, and we don't want to leave these matching dollars on the table. So please, please donate generously. And whatever you donate is going to be doubled until we hit that 30,000. All donations help. Big donations obviously help more. And I want to remind you, there is no limit on how much you can donate. No limit at all. If you want to volunteer for the Environmental Voter Project in mobilizing these voters in New York or elsewhere, no experience is necessary. We start every session with a training, whether you're postcarding or making calls. You can go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved to learn more. And then finally, I just want to say, if you want to introduce the Environmental Voter Project to your friends, I love doing Zoom events like this. It won't be a webinar. You can have a small group of about 15 or 20 friends. We'll have a meeting. We can all see each other. I'll go into more detail about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. We'll then have a long Q&A, and then we'll pitch them and ask them to donate. No one will need to donate ahead of time in order to attend. But if this is something that you're interested in, please email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org or email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, and we will make it happen. Last thing I want to say before we get to the Q&A is, again, please, please donate generously. Many of you, I imagine, have been trying to put off the fact that there is a crucially important election coming up. And I understand why. Of course, you'd want to put off thinking about that. It's enormously stressful. But we're now 6 months away. 6 months to the day. We're exactly 26 weeks away from Election Day. It's time to get in the game. It's time to get in the game. So please take a moment now as we go into the Q&A, open that link and make a generous donation. Get it matched and start helping to realize the results that you want to get 6 months from now. All right. We've got a good amount of time for Q&A. Shannon, what do we got?
Yeah, this was the most common question a few different folks asked. Could you speak a little bit to redistricting in New York? It's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of court decisions. The two main questions were the maps that you were showing reflective of the new districts? And do you have any sense of how these competitive districts may have changed due to redistricting?
So, very, very good question. And for those of you who weren't aware of all of the changes, I'm probably going to miss a lot of details here, but what these people who ask questions were alluding to is in 2022, there were new districts in New York, just like there were everywhere. And so the midterms were run under those districts. However, due to various legal challenges, new maps were then put forward, and there was a whole rigmarole the first time around heading into 2022. Then there was another rigmarole this time around. And then about 2 or 3 months ago, is that about right? Yeah, 2 or 3 months ago, new maps were finally approved. What you're looking at here are the numbers under those new districts. The numbers under those new districts. So these numbers are accurate for the new districts. Now, to get to the second part of the question, broadly speaking, what changes were made from the previous districts in 2022? Not much. Not much. So first, let's take sort of the Hudson Valley district, 17, 18, 19. Very, very little happened there. In the 22nd district, around Utica and Syracuse, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there was a little bit more done to that one, but again, not a lot, not any sort of dramatic changes. Long Island saw a little bit more. In Long Island, Democrats had an expectation, and I think you could argue a reasonable expectation, that the Democratic state legislature in New York would perhaps make those 4 Long Island districts a bit more Democratic friendly. And that didn't really happen. So, although, again, with some caveats, let me, just because I'm sure you won't remember this stuff. Here are the 4 districts, okay? Tom Suozzi's district, this was the district that he recently won from George Santos. That was made a little bit more Democratic friendly to help Tom Suozzi hold on to that. The 2nd congressional district on Long Island, that was, I believe, actually made slightly more Republican friendly. Then the other 2 had small changes. I mean, there were small changes to almost every district, but didn't end up having a significant sort of partisan shift. A little bit, but nothing significant. Forgive me if I got anything there wrong. I think I just got most of that right. You're really, really testing my knowledge of intricacies around redistricting in New York, but I think that's all the right detail there. But very, very good question.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And if folks have additional questions, feel free to send them in the chat. Nathaniel, what do you predict for turnout in New York this year? Is it going to be higher than we expect, lower than we expect based on previous years?
Yeah, great question. So first, let's think nationally. So in 2016, 139 million people voted. I'm sorry, maybe 137 million people voted. In 2020, almost 160 million people voted. Highest turnout of any presidential election ever. Nationally, I think most people expect, and I am among most people in this instance, that turnout's not going to be as high as it was in 2020. I don't think we're going to hit 160 million voters, even though the denominators that the voters can come from, so overall population, but also overall eligible voters and overall registered voters have grown. I'm not sure we're going to hit 160 million. We've got essentially 2 incumbents, neither of whom are extraordinarily popular. And that's going to impact turnout. It's going to impact turnout. Not to mention, there have been a whole bunch of states who have made it harder to vote. Some states have made it easier to vote, but a whole bunch of states who have made it harder to vote. Whereas if you think back to 2020, yes, COVID scared a lot of people from voting, but a whole bunch of states made it much, much easier for people to vote. So when you put all of those factors together, I think we're going to see lower turnout this year nationwide than we saw in 2020. Now let's look at New York. Well, a lot of the stuff that's going to drive turnout elsewhere, so important US Senate races, important states for the Electoral College for presidency, abortion rights ballot questions, those things aren't going to be driving turnout in New York like they are in the Nevadas and the Arizonas and places like that. So yes, everybody is going to know about how important these 7 congressional districts are that I just mentioned. Like there are no secrets in politics anymore. Like people are going to know about this, but I would expect turnout in New York and turnout in these 7 congressional districts to be comparatively low, even compared to lower turnout nationwide. And so there are going to be a whole bunch of people whose sort of default status is staying on the sidelines. And so that's why turnout is even more important. Even more important.
All right, Nathaniel, why aren't these New York environmentalists voting?
Oh man. Okay, good question. Very good question. Very good question. So the short answer is, and I'm sorry, I know this is ultimately a disappointing answer, we don't really know. It's so easy for social scientists to set up experiments to figure out how to get people to do things like vote. But it's a lot harder to set up experiments to figure out why people aren't doing things. And really, the best you can do is ask them. And when you poll people and ask them why they're not doing something that the rest of society views as important, like voting, you get a whole bunch of awful data back. I mean, essentially, people lie their pants off, and they tend to give you what they think are the most socially acceptable reasons or excuses for not voting. So the truth is, most social scientists will say, even if you poll people and ask them why they don't vote, you really shouldn't trust any of that data. But let me tell you what we do know. The first thing is, as I showed you in this New York data, but it holds true nationwide, people who care deeply about climate and the environment are disproportionately young, they're disproportionately people of color, and they're disproportionately lower income. We didn't get into that today, but that's also the case. And what do those three demographic groups have in common? Young people, people of color, and lower income people? Well, one, they all vote less often, but also two, it is often due to voter suppression. And this is not something that many people in the climate and environmental movements often think of, but we should. If any government entity anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting either young people, people of color, or poor people. And that right there is the beating heart of the modern climate movement. And so we really, really need to pay attention to that. And that's why a lot of our messaging deals with the basic logistics of how people vote. And it's proven to work. All right. Second reason why we think these environmentalists aren't voting. The climate movement is oddly apolitical. We have a history of being oddly apolitical. And when I say this, some people bristle, but let me explain myself here. Usually when you ask someone how they go about taking action on climate change, they will give you completely personal behavioral answers. They'll say things like, well, I started biking to work, or I'm eating less meat, or I'm changing the electricity I consume, or I'm driving an electric vehicle. Now, all of these are impactful and they're important, but you have to admit they are weirdly apolitical, right? I mean, would you ever hear someone who cares about reproductive rights talk that way? Would you ever hear someone who cares about gun control talk that way? I mean, imagine one of the most tragic things any of us could imagine happens. Imagine there's a shooting in your neighborhood. Do people react by saying, oh, well, how can I change my personal behavior around guns? Like, no, they automatically understand that this is a systemic political problem that requires a systemic political solution. Yet we in the climate and environmental movements have grown up thinking that whatever made this problem, the solution is not systemic and political. Instead, it is purely personal and individual. And that's largely because of very well-funded fossil fuel PR campaigns. They've spent decades and millions of dollars trying to convince us to not worry about the coal-fired power plant back there, but instead, it's all your fault, buddy, for having a plastic water bottle in your hand. And we bought it. We bought it hook, line, and sinker. And we are still a very apolitical movement. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is a big part of why most people who care deeply about climate and the environment don't see voting and don't see political engagement as the most obvious outlet for their activism. It's a big, big part of what's going on there. All right, Shannon, is that it?
Well, it's not a question, but we have had 3 people send a message in the Q&A, so not everyone can see it, that they've made their donation and they're so excited that it's matched. And we all know social pressure, we use it on our voters, so seems like the folks on this call are wanting me to share that as well. So we've already had 3 folks at least let me know that they've made their donation. And we hope others will do the same. I'll pass it back to you, Nathaniel.
Thank you, Shannon. Gosh, this feels like a phone-a-thon for NPR or something. I love it. Well, surprisingly, that is also the note that I want to end on. Folks, it's now almost 9 p.m. Eastern, which just so happens to be the exact time that polls close in New York State. And so exactly 6 months from now, exactly 26 weeks from this minute, you're going to be sitting down on your couch and watching election returns roll in. I don't want to say this because I know it like feels wrong. It feels like manipulative, like I'm trying to get you worked up, but like, guys, don't have any regrets. Don't. Don't. You're here for a reason. I know you're here for a reason. You care deeply about the climate crisis. You care deeply about the democracy crisis, and you understand how crucially important this election is. And if you have been waiting to get involved, you can't wait much longer. Whether it's with the Environmental Voter Project or something else, like now is the time. It's now. You shouldn't be waiting any longer. And I humbly ask you to donate to support our work. We have individually identified these low propensity environmental voters. We have hundreds of randomized control trials that tell us precisely which messages to deliver to which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to vote. Now, all we need is the money to make it happen. And it just so happens that if you donate tonight, it will be doubled. Please, we don't want to leave money on the table here. So please make a donation, open up that link in the chat, because we are going to close this Zoom in a few seconds. And I don't want you to be wondering like, oh no, where's that link? So just click on it now. And let me thank you ahead of time for supporting our work. It is a true honor for Shannon and me and the whole Environmental Voter Project team to work with all of you. Thank you for putting your trust in us. Thank you for funding our work. And thank you for being the best volunteers out there. Have a wonderful, wonderful night, folks. Bye-bye.